just going to give it a minute to let everybody in, and then we'll get started. (10:01).
How many are you expecting? Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, Bill?
I'm great.
It's a good question. We have about 90 people register, so it just depends how many people decide to get up and sign in. But we will get started. So good morning, everybody. I will want to welcome everyone to the second of our three-part series with Avi Melamed. As a reminder, this is being recorded. So we will send the link and you'll be able to either watch it again, or for those who might miss one of the three sessions, you'll be able to go back and watch it. Today's actually part of a two-part series on Israel's Northern Front. I'm going to give you a really brief background, and then we're going to turn it over to Avi to get started. In 2004, King Abdullah II of Jordan warned about the dangers of the Iranian Shi'ite Crescent and Iran's vision. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, Iran made a significant progress towards fulfilling the goal of being the dominant regional superpower. The backbone of Iran's Shiite Crescent is a network of armed agents and proxies, including dozens of thousands of non-Iranian Shiite militants from across the region. For the last 10 years, Iran has been working on building the Iranian-controlled corridor from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, Lebanon, to the Mediterranean Sea. Iran's corridor is the most significant military threat Israel is facing. Israel has vowed it will do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from securing this passage. Avi will help us understand how Iran built this infrastructure, what threat does it hold for Israel and the region, and what must be done to ensure the corridor and the crescent do not materialize. This morning's presentation will be about 45 minutes with time for Q&A afterwards. You are welcome to put your questions in the chat and we will ask, or we will open it up at the end for everybody to ask questions on their own. So without further ado, Avi, welcome and thank you for being part of our series, Shema Listen series.
Karen, thank you very much. Shalom from Israel. You did a great presentation. Actually, we could move straight to the Q&As.
It was all your writing.
Indeed, as you said, today we are talking about something very significant. The Northern Front, Israel is facing the story of the Iranian Shiite Crescent and the challenges it presents to the state of Israel. As always, I would like to start with some framing so we could understand better the issue that they are dealing with. And I'm going very shortly to earlier time, the 7th century, the Arab Peninsula. Islam emerged in the Arab Peninsula, very quickly becomes a conquering empire led by kings or caliphs. And this is, by the way, the term caliphate that you may be familiar with. The fourth caliph of that empire was Ali bin Abi Talib. He was the son-in-law and cousin of Prophet Muhammad. He was assassinated, and his killing actually fueled a growing power struggle over the question, who is entitled to lead this empire? To make a long story short, the followers of Ali, and particularly his son Al-Hussein, that claimed the crown but was butchered by his political opponent, the followers of Ali and Al-Hussein said, leading the Muslim world can be done only by a male descendant of Ali, the fourth caliph in Islam. The other camp, known as the Sunnis, says, no, it's not about bloodline, it's about the most suitable man for the position. So the camp in Islam, which is the majority, the Sunnis, stands for the concept that says leading Islam is not about bloodline, it's not a dynasty, it's about the best man for the position. The minority, the camp of the Shiites, about 20%, stands for the concept that says it should be done by a male descendant of Ali ibn Abi Talib. The term Shiite, by the way, is very similar to the Hebrew word si'ah, which means a political faction. So in the 7th century, there is a split within Islam, majority Sunnis, minority Shiites, and ever since the sides have been butchering each other, the the gaps ideologically, the narratives, politically, theologically, and so on, the gaps between the sides are non-bridgeable. And this is one of the most substantial narrative of the Shiites. The narrative that says we Shiites, we have been deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world. The crown of leadership was taken away from us by the Sunnis. One day we will claim it back. And apparently that one day is now in our time. I'm now moving to 1979, to Iran, a very dramatic development, a revolution in Iran, Islamic revolution. Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy under the leadership of what is known as the Mullah regime. Mullah is the title of Shiite clergy, and the Mullah regime is structured like a pyramid-shaped structure. There are different ranks. For example, the founder of the Islamic revolution in Iran was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Ayatollah is not his name, this is his rank. There is, by the way, a higher rank that is called the Grand Ayatollah, Ayatollah Uzma. So Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy in 1979, led by the Mullah regime. And the Mullah regime, one of its core values is the narrative that says, we Shiites, we were supposed to lead the Muslim world. The crown was taken from us. Now it is our time. Now it's our opportunity to claim back the crown of leadership. That is what basically fuels this issue of the Crescent, the Shiite Crescent that was described by King Abdullah of Jordan. Actually, this vision of Iran under the leadership of the Mullah regime to create a crescent of control across the Middle East, starting offshore the Mediterranean, crossing through Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the Arab Gulf, Yemen, and actually continuing into Africa. That is the structure or the shape of this Shiite crescent that we are talking about. The task of creating this crescent, of implementing that vision, that task was appointed to a specific force within the Iranian establishment, and this is called Al-Quds Force. The word Al-Quds is very significant. Shortly we'll understand why. Al-Quds is the Arabic name of Jerusalem. By the way, taken from Hebrew, Hakdosha. That's the same source, the same origin. Al-Quds Force is an elite unit, if you wish, a spearhead of the most substantial military power of the Mullah regime, and that is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. In the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, there is a specific force, Al-Quds Force, that it's not so large, but its task is to implement the vision of creating that crescent of control of and influence of the Iranian regime. And that force actually, under the leadership of the previous commander, Major General Qasem Soleimani, you could see his picture on the right-hand side, was actually, and very unfortunately, doing a very effective job in creating a network of proxies and agents around the region. Shortly, we'll see who, how, and why. As you may recall, earlier this year, Major General Qasem Soleimani was eliminated by the United States of America in Iraq. His successor is Major General Ismail Qani that you see to the left-hand side. I can tell you that at this point, couple of months after the killing of Soleimani, there is accumulating information indicating that the efficiency of the work of the Al-Quds Force and its proxies, that efficiency has been substantially damaged or harmed because Major General Qasem Soleimani was moved out of the picture. Apparently, his successor, Qani, struggled to enter Soleimani's big shoes. Now, what were the mechanisms or the platform that enabled the Mullah regime in a relatively very short period of time to expand its influence, to create that crescent of influence across the region? Note that majority of the population in the Middle East are Sunni Muslims, not Shiites, and most of them are Arabs in their ethnicity. In other words, they are definitely not going to be receptive to an Iranian Shiite infiltration. They would be very much suspicious of that. They would reject that, given to the historical complex relations between those camps. However, the Mullah regime was able to take advantage of two major mechanisms or platforms to deepen its influence in the heart of the Arab world. One mechanism was, to make a long story short, the failure of the statehood across the Middle East. The people of the Middle East, mostly the Arabs, were introduced to the concept of statehood in the 20th century. 100 years later, today in 2020, we could sum it up and say that has been an utterly failure. When you look at the picture of the statehood in the Middle East, you could see overwhelmingly Arab states are struggling many different serious challenges. That situation of constant instability in the Arab world, where societies are struggling politically, culturally, economically, resulting in a constant political instability that result in the rise to power of dictators and dictatorship. That turbulence played very well to the hands of the Mullah regime, because the major outcome of that was that in many places the central government was or is very weak. And that is a situation that played very well to the hands of the Mullah regime. To make a long story short, I would say the more chaotic the situation, the better it is playing to the hands of the Mullah regime. Shortly, we'll see a couple of examples of this model that I was describing. So one mechanism, one platform that the Mullah regime very effectively monetize or manipulate was and is the weakness of the structure of the state in the region, particularly, of course, Arab states. And then there is another significant mechanism, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a young conflict in the region, and by far it is very small in comparison to other huge conflicts that rocked and shake this region from side to side through the centuries. However, the conflict is very much present in the discussion, the narratives, the mindset of the people of the Middle East, and particularly the Arabs in the Middle East. The Palestinians are Arabs in their ethnicity, and 99% of the Palestinians are Sunni Muslims, not Shiites, Sunni Muslims, like majority of the Muslims in the world, like majority of the Arabs. The Mullah regime very skillfully identified the centrality of the conflict in the discussion of the people of the Middle East. And the Mullah regime did something very simple, positioning itself on the Palestinian side, presenting itself as the defender of the Palestinian in the struggle against Israel, knowing that by doing that, the Mullah regime will harvest political dividends in the Arab world, and, not less important, will bypass suspicious and resentment of the Sunni Arab population. In that context, the Mullah regime actually enhanced, promote a concept that became an integral term in the Middle East dictionary and language. And this is a concept that is known in Arabic as al-muqawama wal-mumana'a, or in translation, the resistance and defiance. To make a long story short, the concept of the resistance, al-muqawama, in the contemporary Middle East is mostly associated with the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Iran actually positioned itself as the leader of axis that is known by the name the axis of resistance, محور المقاومة, and this axis vows the concept or the idea that say the state of Israel must be eliminated. There should be no discussions, no negotiations, no reconciliation, no peace, no nothing. Israel has to be eradicated, and it has to be eradicated by use of violence. And the reason for that is that, according to that outlook, Israel is a foreign entity that was implanted in the body of the Middle East. Israel, according to that outlook, is not indigenous to the Middle East. It is a colonialistic, imperialistic product. And not only that, it is a rapist product. In the Arab terminology, Israel quite often described as al-kiyan al-mughtasib, meaning the rapist entity. Echoing that narrative of the resistance and that content that I described right now played very well to the hands of the mullah regime, because it was very well received in wide levels and circles in the Arab world. So the mullah regime was very efficiently taking advantage of these two platforms: the weakness of the Arab states and the governments and the chaotic situations and conditions in some of those states, and the centrality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the discussion mindset of the people of the region. So these are the platforms that the mullah regime has been mostly and is mostly using to enhance its influence. For example, what you see in front of you is a poster that was recently published by the mullah regime. Every year in the last day of the month of Ramadan, the last Friday of the month of Ramadan, is a day that is called Al-Quds Day, which, not surprisingly now you can understand, is very much praised by the mullah regime. In that day, there are ceremonies and petitions and speeches and other things that actually express the commitment of the Muslim world to liberate Al-Quds, meaning Jerusalem. You see in this poster, you may be able to recognize that structure. This is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, in the Temple Mount compound, a very famous Islamic symbol. And not less interesting to see are the figures that are appearing on that poster. And you see some of them are numbered. For example, you may be able to recognize number 1, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the Lebanese terror organization Hezbollah. Next to him, number 2, Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas Islamic movement. Number 4 is Ziad Nakhala, the leader of Islamic Jihad in Palestine. You may be able up there to see on the sky, number 10, the cloud in the shape of Major General Qasem Soleimani. These are all figures that are part of this axis of resistance, and obviously not by chance, they appear in that poster published by the mullah regime. And now, this is the time to actually start and go deeper and understand, okay, who are the contractors? Who is doing that job on the ground in the end of the day? Who carry out that mission of exporting the Islamic revolution and exporting Iranian influence across the Middle East? And we are looking at a network of proxies, agents, proxies. In a minute, I will explain the difference that the mullah regime has deployed and activate very effectively around the region to enhance its vision. Let us first take a look generally. You see this map in front of you, the Middle East. You could see these yellow slogan symbols. All are standing for Iranian-backed Shiite, mostly Shiite militias. And you could see very well they are actually scattered all the way from the Mediterranean, all the way to Iran. Shortly, we will get to know more intimately those groups. Creating proxies and or nurturing existing entities on the ground that played to the hands of the mullah regime, that is the major tool the Mullah regime uses in order to create the crescent of influence and in order to enhance his hegemonic vision. Let us start with the area which is very close to Israel, Gaza Strip, in the southwest part of Israel, between Israel and Egypt. The Iranians are massively supporting a couple of Palestinian militant Islamist groups in Gaza Strip. Obviously, the most significant one, Hamas. Hamas is offspring of the Muslim Brotherhood. Remind you again, the Palestinians are not Shiites, they are Sunnis. Okay? But Hamas vows to eliminate Israel. Hence, Hamas is a very dear member in the axis of resistance that the Iranian created. So Hamas, and then the second largest military organization in Gaza Strip, Islamic Jihad in Palestine. You could see the logos here down. One here to the left is Hamas. The one here in the center is the logo of Islamic Jihad in Palestine. These are two major Palestinian forces in Gaza Strip. There are also other groups, as you could see. The Iranian massively support those groups, arms those groups, provide them with military know-how, finance, and so on and so on. This is the far edge of this Iranian crescent offshore the Mediterranean, southwest of Israel. Moving north of Israel, in an Arab state called Lebanon, the most substantial and powerful proxy of the Iranians, this time we are talking about proxy, meaning the Hezbollah in Lebanon. The word Hezbollah is two words which means the party of God. The Hezbollah in Lebanon was established by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in 1982, and it is mostly based upon Lebanese Shiites. It is today the most powerful proxy of the Iranians, with the fire capacities, missiles capacities, rockets capacities that only few states on the planet have, if at all. And this is the most significant proxy of the Mullah regime. Actually, Hezbollah controls Lebanon. You got in Lebanon government and political parties and army and so on and so on. But the real boss in Lebanon is the Hezbollah, keeping its independent military might and using that might to actually dictate the Iranian interest upon Lebanon, whether they like it or don't like it. Lebanon became a satellite of the Mullah regime in that process that I was describing right now. By the way, when Gaza Strip, when Hamas conducted a military coup in 2007, butchering his own brothers, the Palestinian Authority, and kicking them out, Hamas was criticized for the brutality, and Hamas says, well, we have to do that because the Palestinian Authority betrayed the way of the resistance. The story with Lebanon. Hezbollah justifies all the time the fact that he holds this military capacity. The holy grail is this word, the resistance. I'm keeping my missiles and rockets because it's part of the resistance. Don't you dare touching this weapon, Hezbollah says to the Lebanese, because this is the holy weapon of the resistance. You could see how powerful that slogan has been serving the Iranians' interest. Lebanon is an Iranian satellite. Syria, bordering Israel from the northeast. The Mullah regime is massively involved in the war in Syria since 2011, since the early stage, ordering Hezbollah to move from Lebanon, to send his armed forces to Syria to fight and to save Assad regime from falling down, because Syria is an enormously significant component in the structure of the Crescent that the Iranian regime has been building, and particularly in the context of something that I will talk about in a couple of minutes, and this is the land corridor that Iran strives to create from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean. Assad regime is a significant strategic ally of the Iranians. In Syria, there has been headquarters coordinating the activities and planning of the factors that belongs to the axis of the resistance. Syria became a transition point for the Iranian weapons streaming to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the same weapon with which Lebanon was hijacked by the Hezbollah. In Syria, there are factories manufacturing rockets and missiles and all kinds of weapons. Syria became the most significant component for the Mullah regime in the context of their vision, and the possibility of downfall of Bashar al-Assad rule in Syria is a bad news to the Iranians, because it means the whole structure will fall apart, because if Assad will go down, what will happen in Syria will be a new political arrangement. Very shortly to explain, Syria used to be 22, 23 million people. 80% of the Syrians are Sunnis. However, for the last 50 years, because it is a failing state, Syria is ruled by a minority called Alawites, about 2 million people, about 10% of the population. The Alawites, Assad is one of the Alawites family, the Alawites are considered to be a distant branch of the Shiites. So Syria, a predominantly Arab Sunni state, is ruled by a distant branch of the Shiites, a brutal dictatorship, and that brutal dictatorship is a significant strategic ally of the Mullah regime, as I explained before. In Syria, the Iranian has deployed many militias, Shiite militias, Hezbollah, as I said before, Iraqi Shiite militias, shortly we'll say something about it, Afghan, Pakistani, and they are deployed in Syria since the early stage of the war, fighting shoulder to shoulder with Assad against the Syrian to maintain the control and influence of the Iranians in Syria. Iran occupies parts of Syria physically today, including phenomena of relocating population, ethnical cleansing, and stuff like that. Moving east of Syria, we reach Iraq, yet another Arab state, and yet another Arab state that falls apart and crumbles. In Iraq, there are three major communities: Sunni Iraqis, Kurds Iraqis. Most of the Kurds are not Arabs in their ethnicity. Most of the Kurds are Sunnis as well. And the third group, which is the largest one, in terms of ethnicity and religion, are Iraqi Shiites. They are the biggest group in Iraq. They are not Persians, they are Arabs, Iraqis, but they are Shiites. The crumbling of Iraq, the disintegration of the state, the spread of weapons, corruption, and other things provides Iran a very fertile ground, like in Lebanon, to enhance its influence on the ground in the shape of network of armed militias, Iraqi Shiite militias that are operating in parallel to the Iraqi armed forces. Those militias that are structured in a frame called Al-Hashd al-Sha'abi, the popular mobilization units, those militias are acting according to Iraqi law. They are budgeted by the Iraqi government. However, the major Shiite militias in that frame are actually obeying the orders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. In other words, you are looking at a situation where domestic Iraqi forces are actually acting against the Iraqi people and against the interest of the Iraqi brothers in the service of their Iranian masters. And those militias, to make it more crazy, those militias are budgeted by no other than the Iraqi government. Let's show you the distortion of the situation in that context. Once again, very well used by the Iranians to influence the situation in Iraq. Iran has an enormous influence in Iraq, to the point those militias are used by the Iranians to try and to oppress, to suffocate violently by killing Iraqi protesters on the streets. To that extent, the distortion is in Iraq. The person, by the way, you see in the picture is not with us anymore. His name was Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He was the second in command in this frame of the popular mobilization units, the Hashd al-Sha'bi, and he was very close to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. He was killed together with Major General Qasem Soleimani in the US strike in January 3rd, 2020. By the way, his killing was also a major blow to the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Unit. To conclude this spread of proxies and agents, in Yemen, an enormously strategic point, Iran has a very valuable, significant partner, I would say. I wouldn't say it's a proxy or an agent, but it's definitely a partner, a coalition of Yemenite Shiite tribes called Houthis, traditionally based in the northern part of Yemen. Yemen is predominantly Sunni. However, the Houthis in Yemen are about 35%. In 2014, the Houthi conducted a military coup, ousting the Yemenite government. Massively backed by the Iranians, the Houthis in Yemen quickly spread their control in Yemen. As a reaction to that, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates formed a coalition, military coalition, to push back the Houthis and to end the coup and to restore the control of the Yemenite ousted government. The reason for the Saudi and the UAE step is because they are enormously threatened by the Iranians, and they know that the Iranians, by supporting the Houthis in Yemen, are creating themselves a stronghold in the back door of Saudi Arabia and Yemen and United Arab Emirates, presenting a major challenge to their national security, a concern that is very, very valid and sustainable. So this is the network of these proxies that the Mullah regime has been creating and nurturing in this region. Another milestone, significant one, was the JCPOA, the signing of the agreement regarding Iran's nuclear program in 2015. To make a long story short, that agreement, unfortunately, apparently against the anticipation of the Western negotiators, that agreement did not make the Iranian regime a reasonable player. To the opposite. The aggression of the Mullah regime significantly boosted following the agreement, because the agreement didn't deal with two of the most substantial components of the Iranian hegemonic vision. It didn't deal with the issue of the proxies, and it didn't deal with the Iranian missiles program. As far as the Iranians are concerned, the JCPOA was a great deal. Unfortunately, that is not the situation we are looking when we are talking about the West, and I'm including in that Israel. The JCPOA resulted in a growing aggression of the Iranian regime across the region, in the Gulf, in the Red Sea. By the way, in 2018, before President Trump pulled out from the JCPOA, before the Iranian, for the first time, launched a direct military attack on Israel from Syria. Following the signing of the JCPOA, unfortunately, the Iranian aggression boosted enormously across the region. In that sense, we are all paying very severe price for the bitter fruit of that agreement. And now let me go back to the story of the Iranian land corridor. As I said before, Iran strives to create a land corridor. You see here on the map the way they scatter their militias all the way from Iran, through Iraq, Syria, to the Mediterranean, Lebanon, as well as the Gaza Strip. You could see here the two red arrows, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip. That land corridor in the Iranian mindset has two major purposes. One is to perpetuate in an irreversible way the control of Iran over Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. A control that, as I said before, to a large extent already exists. The other component is that this is part of an Iranian master plan that actually aims to destroy the state of Israel through the creation of a strangling loop around Israel's neck. Parts of that loop exist. One of them is in Lebanon in the shape of the Hezbollah and its missiles and rockets capacities. The other one is in Gaza Strip in the shape of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The capacities of Hamas and Islamic Jihad are much smaller than Hezbollah's. Just the same, they have a common denominator. The military thinking beyond the Iranian strangling loop is to use weapon that is aiming deliberately cities, infrastructures, communities, meaning missiles and rockets. Understanding that Israel has a lot of advantages technologically, militarily, and so on, the Iranian regime basically focus or laser point the soft belly of the state of Israel, and these are the civilians, the cities, the communities, the airports, the infrastructures, the water infrastructure, the electricity, the gas, and so on and so on. That's the reason why the major weapon chosen to that end by the Iranians is rockets and missiles. And to conclude that strangling loop, Syria is the final link of that loop, where the Iranians are planning and trying to create in Syria a massive military infrastructure, duplicating the model of missiles, rockets, and adding to that thousands of Shiite militants that are already in Syria, as I mentioned before, Afghans and Pakistanis and Iraqis, and actually creating a strangling loop around Israel's neck. That strangling loop has a purpose, and the purpose is to eliminate the state of Israel. The Iranian regime even gives timeline. The original plan was by 2025. Now it was postponed to 2050. How do I know that? Because the Iranians are saying that openly. The scenario of this strangling loop around Israel's neck is nothing less than an existential threat to the state of Israel. Dozens and dozens and dozens of thousands of rockets and missiles landing in Israeli cities will bring the state of Israel to an end. You just got an example of what can happen with such major explosion last week in Beirut. Now take whatever exploded in Beirut and multiply that 50 times, you get the picture. That's what the Iranians and the Hezbollah and Hamas are planning for the state of Israel. The map that you see in front of you shows you different potential paths through which the Iranians try to stream on the land, other than the airways, missiles and rockets and militants. The most significant path in that context and the most relevant is the one that crosses through the middle of Syria. You see this pink area. This is a desert area, and particularly this point right here, which is the crossing point between Syria and Iraq. This is Iraq, this is Syria, this is the crossing point. From this point, taking advantage of the fact that they have network of proxies, Iraqi Shiite proxies on the ground, the mullah regime has been establishing a transitional station located in the Syrian side, very close to the Iraqi-Syrian border passage. It has two names. The Iraqi side, it's called Al-Qaim, and on the Syrian side, it's known by the name of Bu Kamal. And the Iranian regime established there a transition station through which they are planning on streaming missiles, weapons, ammunitions, militants, and so on and so on. Let me share with you very quickly some picture of that area. Can you see that? So what you see here is the area of the border passage. I'll just give you a different perspective a little bit. What you see to the right-hand side, this is actually the Iraqi side. you could see this pink line right here. The pink line that you see right here is the border crossing between Syria, which is to the left, and Iraq. This is the area of Qa'im. This is the border crossing right here. And what I want to do now is I want to zoom in to the Syrian side. And if you look, I'll show you. You could see this compound right here, these white buildings that you see right here. This is the Iranian compound built on the Syrian side next to the crossing. It's called Al-Imam Ali military compound. By the way, there are tunnels there, and it could contain thousands of militants. That point, as I said before, a transition station for the Iranian forces streaming from Iraq, crossing into Syria, and reminding you, their end game is to reach all the way to the west part of Syria. In other words, to reach to the area of Israel, the Golan Heights, and of course, Lebanon. Now you could see the big picture right here. This is the crossing point right here. This is the western part of Syria. This is Lebanon. This is Israel. Here is the Golan Heights. That's the purpose of this corridor, as I was mentioning before. Now, going back to our presentation, going back to our map, I hope that you could see the map. Let me just very quickly go down to towards the final presentation of that map right here. What you see here is the map of Syria as of today. You could see there are different forces scattered in Syria, but the reason I'm showing you is you notice that the symbols of the Iranian forces they have the signs of these explosions. That basically represent the fact that Israel has been and is attacking the Iranians and their proxies, including Assad, if needed, in Syria, in different locations in Syria, because Israel vows to prevent the Iranian attempt to create the strangling loop. Israel accurately reads the Iranian master plan, and Israel says, we are determined to prevent it at all costs, including at the cost of massive war. Because, as I said before, the creation of that Iranian strangling loop around Israel's neck basically means a death sentence to the state of Israel. That's the reason why Israel openly said, we attacked hundreds of times in Syria. According to foreign reports, Israel attacked also the crossing point, El-Qaim, that I just showed you more than once. There has been also report that the United States forces that are also scattered in the region also attacked Iranian convoys coming from Iraq entering to Syria. In other words, the Iranian land corridor and their attempt to create this military infrastructure around Israel's neck, as far as Israel is concerned, that has to be prevented at all costs, even if it's going to mean a regional war, because of the severe existential threat the Iranian master plan presents to the state of Israel. And just to conclude our presentation, let me just show you very shortly documentation of one of the Israeli attacks. This time it's on an surface-to-air battery in Syria. You don't see it? Let me try again. Can you see it now? All right, so let me show it from the beginning. This is a documentation of an Israeli attack. You could see it's January 2019. Ever since, there has been many more attacks. Israel Air Force is attacking many targets in Syria time and again in order to try to prevent the attempt of the Iranians to create that military infrastructure. One of the things that the Iranians are trying to do, which is part of that huge threat they present to Israel, this is another attack. One of the things that they are doing is they are trying to actually develop the already existing massive arsenal of rockets and missiles that the Hezbollah has in its possession. And the Iranians are trying to make those missiles and weapons precise, meaning They are both trying to increase the amount of explosives on those rockets. Most of the rockets that the Hezbollah has are short range and not accurate. What the Iranians and the Hezbollah are trying to do is to develop and to manufacture in Lebanon an industry that actually will take those rockets and missiles and add more, but will add more explosives and, most significantly, will add a device that will make those missiles and rockets accurate, meaning they could hit targets in a radius of 10 meters. Again, this is a threat that is an enormous existential threat to the state of Israel, and the state of Israel is determined to prevent that threat at all costs. This is the story of the Iranian Shiite Crescent. This is the way it's formed. This is its major components. This is the story of the Iranian land corridor, and this is why Israel is facing such a severe strategic existential threat. I cannot be more clear and specific about it. And that's the reason why that threat has to be outrooted at any cost. I'm opening this session to your questions.
So thank you very much, Avi. A lot to think about here and process. I'm going to just give you a heads up that there was a question about the Israel-UAE agreement and the effect short-term and long-term. But I'd like to put that aside and maybe have you address that last, and then people can either stay on or choose to get off the call.
Sure.
So I will start with how much control does Hamas have in Gaza? If there were to be negotiations regarding the Gaza Strip, what group or groups would be at the table?
Hamas has full control over Gaza Strip. Hamas employs dozens of thousands of officials. It's a government. It employs dozens of thousands of militant personnel, security forces. It has courts, it legislates laws, it provides the curriculum at school. This is a government. And Hamas controls Gaza Strip in an iron fist. The second largest organization in Gaza Strip, also military organization, militant Islamic organization, is Islamic Jihad in Palestine, IJIP. Both, as I said before, Hamas and Islamic Jihad vows to eliminate the state of Israel. They will never ever accept Israel's existence, and as far as they are concerned, if they could, they will continue endlessly the violence. The major difference between Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine is that since Hamas is a government and Hamas is rooted in Gaza Strip, meaning the people of Gaza Strip are Hamas, many of them. Hamas is the people of Gaza Strip. Hamas therefore has to bear responsibilities for the people. So that responsibility restrained sometimes Hamas militant ideology and plans. Islamic Jihad in Palestine is less concerned about governmental positions and responsibility because Islamic Jihad is not the government. And Islamic Jihad is 100% pure resistance, al-muqawama, meaning eliminating the state of Israel. So in the context of the relationship between the two organizations, who are mostly cooperating together because they share lots of common denominator, there is sometimes tensions between the two vis-a-vis the question, how much, in what circumstances do you launch attack on Israel? You fire rockets or whatever. Because sometimes there is a collision in the interest of the two, though, again, as I said before, generally speaking, of course, they share the same vision, eliminating Israel. They are massively supported by the Iranians, and they are vowing to eliminate Israel through the use of violence. Hamas rules Gaza Strip. Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine will never, ever recognize Israel's right to exist.
Okay, and can you briefly discuss the influence of the Soviet Union in all of this?
Russia is back in the Middle East, and it's back big time. President Putin identified a great opportunity, the war in Syria. In 2015, despite of all their efforts, the Assad and its allies, the Iranians, were losing the game in 2015. Desperately, they went to Assad, to Putin in Russia, asking him to intervene militarily directly. Putin responded. He sent his squadrons, basically eliminating towns and villages in Syria, killing dozens of thousands of Syrian civilians, calling it fighting terror. Basically, he was able to turn the tables, to turn the cards, and thanks to Putin, Assad and the Iranians were able to regain control and to avoid a defeat in Syria. Putin is a strange guy. He doesn't give free meals. He's back in Syria. He's now in Syria. He's back in the Middle East. He's back to stay. In Syria, he has two bases, naval and aerial base, long-term lease. He's the real boss in that sense in Syria. Assad and the Iranians know that without Putin aerial umbrella, they will not be able to sustain in Syria. Being in Syria provides Putin great advantages. He's sitting on a land corridor connecting Central Asia with Europe, meaning the gas, the flow of the natural gas. He's sitting at Europe's back door. He's very close to the eastern basin of the Mediterranean with its huge natural gas reserves. Using Syria and its presence in Syria, Putin now extends its influence into different parts of the region, like Egypt, like Libya, like the Gulf states, Lebanon as well. Not less significant, Putin is very significant for Israel and vice versa. So the presence of Putin in Syria, as far as Israel is concerned, is basically a good thing because Putin is the one that can restrain, in Putin style, the Iranians and their proxies in Syria. By the way, one of the major complaints that Assad and the Iranians have to Putin is that Putin and his people are watching to the other side while Israel is bombing hundreds of times Iranian proxies and Assad targets in Syria. That's good for Putin because though Putin is, in the context of Syria, though he is on the same side of Iran and Assad, they definitely don't have the same interest. In fact, the more Assad was able to restore control over Syria, ironically, the rifts between Iran and Russia are rising to the surface, probably because they are kind of like fighting over the bear skin. Putin has no interest particularly to provide any advantages to the Iranians in Syria. So therefore, as far as Putin is concerned, when the Iranians are sustaining massive blow by Israel day in, day out, that's fine with him. He could live with it. He shed no tear. And that's good for Israel as well. Russia is back in the Middle East. Putin is a clever, cynical, sophisticated leader. He's focused laser. He knows where he's going. He has no moral restriction, and he gets there.
Are there any other questions about the presentation today? Feel free to unmute. Okay, so before we address the UAE, I want to thank everybody for attending today. And I just want to let you know that next week will be a little bit different. Avi has actually gone up to the northern border and has done some filming of the border. And it will be an interactive presentation with people who live along the border. So definitely bring questions along with you, and it should be a wonderful open conversation. So so thank you on behalf of Shema Listen and the Israel Center, and Avi, let's talk about the UAE-Israel agreement that just happened this last week.
Yes, historical moment, great event, not surprising. We saw it coming. We have been witnessing a process of rapprochement for the last couple of years between Israel and the Arab Gulf states. And of course, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There is a reason for that. In fact, one major reason for that was discussed today, and that's the story of the Iranian Crescent. The Iranian hegemonic vision, the story of the Shiite Crescent that we talked about today, presents a serious threat not only to Israel, but not less to Arab Gulf monarchies who are in proximity to Iran. The roots of that conflict goes deep into the history. Sunni versus Shiites, we talked about it. Arabs versus Persians. And now the Iranian mullah regime feels that he has the upper hand to fulfill its biggest narrative of taking back the crown of leadership that allegedly, according to the Shiite narratives, was taken away from them by the loathed Sunnis. The Iranian hegemonic vision presents a serious threat to the Arab Gulf monarchies. Adding to that, growing challenges economically, politically, culturally, the challenge of COVID-19, all those things together actually resulted in a changing agenda and priorities of Gulf states, not only them, but particularly in the context of our discussion, the Gulf states. And that change of agenda has two major manifestations or representations. One, the issue of the Palestinian cause that traditionally was on a top level, on a top grade in the Arab discussion. The issue of the Palestinian cause has been downgraded in the agenda of the Arab world, and particularly in the agenda of the Gulf monarchies. By the way, not only because of the fact that they are busy now with some more severe challenges, as I mentioned before, the Iranians and other issues, but also because of the fact that the Arab Gulf monarchies are simply fed up with the Palestinians, their politics, the Palestinian split. The Arab Gulf monarchies provided a very generous support to the Palestinians through the years. The Arab Gulf monarchies has been playing always a role in trying to help the Palestinians to navigate the way. In the face of the Palestinian split between Hamas and Palestinian Authority, the Arab Gulf monarchies more than once were basically trying to mediate reconciliation. There were agreements signed. Those agreements were never fulfilled. They didn't see the daylight. These are all things that create a growing discontent and resentment in the Arab Gulf monarchies. Addition to that, the fact that major Palestinian groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad in Palestine, are actually on the Iranian side and also siding with another major opponent of the Arab Gulf monarchy, which is Turkey. Maybe we'll have sometime in the future the opportunity to talk about the story of Turkey. All those things together, in the end of the day, resulted in a situation where in the Arab Gulf states there has been a growing, intensifying process of distancing themselves from the story of the Palestinians, downgrading the issue of the story of the Palestinians. But this is only one part of the story, because the biggest part is the following. The Gulf states are enormously threatened militarily by the Iranians. Reminding you, the Iranians attacked Saudi Arabia. They attacked ships and vessels of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. The Iranians are threatening every Monday and Thursday to attack their neighbors, the Arab Gulf monarchies. Given that the Arab Gulf monarchies are looking for powerful partner, and they found one, it's called Israel. Israel is a regional power. Some say the most powerful factor in the Middle East. And Israel shares the same concern of the Arab Gulf monarchies, meaning the threat of the Iranian hegemonic vision, as well, by the way, the threat of the Turkish hegemonic vision. In other words, what we see is a conjunction of a long-term strategic interest that bring Arab Gulf monarchies and Israel together to the table. I said earlier that the signing of the peace agreement was not really a big surprise. It didn't really a shocking out of the blue. We saw that happening for the last couple of years. We knew there is a rapprochement going on. So that process, that point, that event is yet another milestone, very historically one and so on, dramatic one, but on the scale of that process of rapprochement that I was describing before. That what fueled that rapprochement, the story of the realigning of the Middle East, the Iranian threat, the discontent of the Arab Gulf monarchies with the Palestinians' politics, the needs of the Arab Gulf politics to find themselves a new partner that could be valuable for their long-term strategic interest. All those things together resulted in a situation where we see this rapprochement, and right now, a pinnacle of that process is the signing of the Israeli United Arab Emirates peace agreement, we will not be surprised to see if there are other countries that are joining in. For example, I would not be surprised if Bahrain or Oman will join in. By the way, right now, this very hours, I've been working on an article that I'm going to publish hopefully tomorrow, basically analyzing the initial reactions of regional players to this event. And so I could give you a heads up. You have the advantage of taking it fresh from the oven as it's still hot. Not so surprisingly, Iran and Turkey, of course, are opposing that. Why are they opposing the peace agreement? Because Iran and Turkey are using the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a pawn, as a card. They have an interest not only in the perpetuation of the conflict, but also in the escalation of the conflict, because it works, it plays very well to their hands. We talked today about Iran, maybe some other time we'll talk about the Turkish perspective on that issue. Not so surprisingly, Egypt and other Arab Gulf states rushed to congratulate and to say this is a very positive act. And an interesting observation that I would share with you, the United Arab Emirates, obviously knowing that they are going to face this criticism coming from Iran and Turkey and other proxies in the region, by the way, they are all waving with the flag of this is a treachery, this is you have betrayed the Palestinian cause, you have betrayed the Al-Aqsa, you have betrayed Jerusalem, you have betrayed them. And the marketing package that the United Arab Emirates uses to counter that argument has two arguments. It's double head, sort of speaking. One, it says to the Turks and the Iranians, you better shut up. You better shut up because you are causing such a damage and destruction in the Arab world. You are the last one to talk about defending the Palestinians because this is the last thing that you are really interested about. By the way, this is correct. The second thing, and which is very interesting, the United Arab Emirates says, well, they say, actually, when you think about it, the Palestinians should be happy with this peace agreement. This peace agreement serves the Palestinian cause. Now, the Palestinians, of course, are totally unhappy with that. The Palestinian Authority called back its ambassador in United Arab Emirates. But why would that agreement, according to the United Arab Emirates, serves the Palestinian cause? Because the United Arab Emirates says to them, well, they say, look, thanks to that agreement, the whole issue of annexation is off the table. In other words, we, through the agreement, saved Palestinian land, which serves a Palestinian major interest. That's the logic that, the marketing logic that the UAE basically packaged the deal to sell it, sort of speaking, in the Arab world, even though, as I said before, in the end of the day, with or without marketing package, it's done deal because it serves a strategic interest of the United Arab Emirates. There was a great article written by some Saudi senior publicist who basically summed it up very well. He said, look, there are two things that are non-controversial, he said. One, the Palestinians are free to decide whatever they want to do and whenever they want to go. This is their own decision. Whatever the Palestinians decide, we, the Arab, will respect that. He's, by the way, echoing the most recent Saudi and Egyptian position towards the Palestinian. The Saudis and the Egyptians says to the Palestinian, guys, they say, you are grown up, you are standing on your own, whatever you decide, go for it. We are supporting you. In other words, they're basically saying to them, guys, go figure whatever you want to do and leave us alone. The second thing this guy said was interesting. He said, the same way the Palestinian has the right to decide whatever they want to do in the context of they want to fight, fight. They want to negotiate, negotiate. He said the second thing is that the same way it's legitimate for the Palestinians to decide, it is legitimate for every state to decide what's the best for its interest and strategic interest. Therefore, he says, if the United Arab Emirates decided that its strategic interest is to have peace with Israel, so will it be, because it serves the United Arab interests. Is it not legitimate? These are two arguments that are very valid, of course. he plays those arguments very wisely because he understands the atmosphere and the discussion in the region. So these are a couple of short, you can say that you got the pre-baked version, you got it first. Now, by the way, obviously, I didn't mention Saudi Arabia. The Saudis didn't say anything formally, but as you could understand, such a move would not have been done without the blessing of Saudi Arabia.
Are there any follow-up questions? All right, so we will look for your article. And thank you very much. Again, on behalf of the Shema Listen Speaker Series and the Israel Center, we're thrilled to have had you here, Avi. We look forward to next week. And just a quick heads up that next week's session may go a little bit longer than an hour because we will have 2 or 3 people that will be participating on our conversation. So if you want to mark your calendar, just an extra half hour, that would be great. Again, thank you. Have a fantastic week, and we look forward to seeing everybody next Sunday at 10 a.m.
Thank you so much, Karen. Shalom from Israel. Take care.